Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name's Lucy Starbuck-Braidley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice. And hopefully, as well, as I say every week, hopefully shine some light on titles that you can bring into your libraries, into your classrooms, and onto your bookshelves at home as well. This week, I'm very excited because I am joined by Pedro Martin, who has created one of my favourite titles for young readers that I've read this year, a brilliant book called Mexikid. You will hear a lot more about that in this episode. Pedro is a former Hallmark artist and the creator of Asteroid Andy. He chronicles life growing up Mexican-American online in a comic series called Mexikid Stories and also in his debut graphic memoir, Mexikid. Here's what Pedro had to say.
Hi, Lucy. How's it going?
It's good, thanks. I'm really excited to have you on. We've just been chatting beforehand, but I didn't actually mention how much I love your book. I genuinely, my favourite book of the year. I absolutely loved it. Yeah, no, I really, really loved it. And we're going to talk about it in a lot more detail. But first of all, can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a comics reader? Because that's how we always start the podcast. Where did your love of comics all start?
Well, the interesting part about it is that my family are from Mexico, and my father and my mother were both undereducated. My father only went to like third grade, and I don't think my mom ever went to any kind of school. And so we didn't really have books in the house. But I had a huge amount of brothers and sisters. There's 9 kids in my family. But my older brothers and sisters, as soon as they started kind of getting their own money and they started bringing in like Mad Magazine into the house, which that was like exactly where I learned how to read, because like it was just everywhere. The pictures were funny. I could kind of sort of figure out what was going on. I could figure out the sound effects and stuff like that. And it just kind of like picked up from there. So whatever they brought in the house, that's what I consumed. And they eventually brought in comic books. I would consume comic books. And then it kind of, expanded from there. And then I became a total geek. And when I did have my own money, then that's where it went. It went to comic books. It went to, walking, the mile and a half to the quick stop store to pick up comic books every Wednesday or whatever it was, and read them on the way back home and store them under the bed and everything. So it's been going on for a while. And
what do you think it was that pulled you in and made you into that geek?
I didn't think about it until later, but I really liked just not knowing what was going to happen next. And I liked just having a twist and a turn. And because comic books, it's a monthly thing, they always leave you hanging.
The cliffhanger.
And I was just a sucker for that kind of thing. And every time I find something like that, and I'm a big fan of like the old Flash Gordon serials and stuff like that. So I just loved, even though the Flash Gordon serials, their cliffhangers were ridiculous. And their solutions were insane and ridiculous. I just loved that feeling of like, what's going to happen next? And so those monthly comic books were like that for me. Were like, I can't wait for next month to find out what happens.
That's really interesting, because a few times this season, talking to guests, TV has cropped up as being something that they were also really engrossed in and loved at the same time as a child. And I wonder if there is that link between that kind of the weekly TV. Obviously it doesn't happen anymore. Well, it does sometimes, but Netflix generation has not got quite the same length of wait for the next episode of a TV program. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And even if they are, like, if we are binging, it's like between the bathroom break of one episode and the next episode, you're like in the bathroom, you're like, ooh, how are the Peaky Blinders going to get out of this jam? We just did a whole binge of Peaky Blinders.
I love Peaky Blinders.
Oh my God, it was too much. It was too much.
You need a rest now.
Yes, I did say, let's watch cooking shows for a while. Let's just,
you need to decompress.
relax.
So what sort of, you mentioned a couple of titles, but are there any particular highlights of titles that you loved as a child? And also then bringing that into your current reading diet. What do you like? What things that are out there at the moment are you really enjoying reading?
Well, originally, like, I really liked kind of compilations of old Silver Age comics where they would do like the Superman family comic, and it was like $1, and then you would get like an entire story arc in one book. It was kind of the early graphic novel, which I really loved because I loved having the whole arc in one shot. Yeah. Which was a lot of fun. So all those kind of reprints of the old Silver Age comics were kind of my bread and butter for the longest time, just because I could get them all at the same time and I could, sit and do the whole thing. Nowadays, actually, the funny thing is that now I'm kind of on a mini book tour. I'm doing a lot of book festivals, the library festivals. And so I've been picking up other panelists' books and trying to read them either after I've talked to them or before I've seen them, kind of thing. So I'm kind of reading a bunch of middle grade stuff. Like, what was I just reading? Remy Lai. And she did a book called Ghost Book that just came out.
Okay, didn't know that one.
It's really lovely. It's very kind of cool. She's from out of Australia, and she was sitting with me at one of the signing tables, and I happened to look over at her signing books, and I always sign with a big stamp. I have a big rubber stamp, and I looked over, and she was drawing a portrait of everybody who came up to get her book. It was infuriating. What are you talking about?
Showing you up.
I'm clearly 30 years her senior, and I have this lazy stamp that I'm like, oh. But her book is really wonderful, and I just picked up Last Kids on Earth and the Forbidden Fortress, and then I was rereading Persepolis because I'm trying to write something new, and I'm like, I need to kind of cleanse the palette of the nowness of things and trying to like get into somebody doing a more of a memoir kind of thing, and that book is just one of the great memoirs, that
definitely.
Simply told and just beautiful black and white and just really lovely. And it's just nice to kind of like sit down and go through it one more time and go like, oh yeah, you can just let the pictures take the lead in some cases, just let the reader fill it in, for themselves, which I forget, because as the writer illustrator, I feel like I have all the information that I want you to have, and I'm eagerly pushing it out towards you. And sometimes I forget that you don't need that as a reader. Like you have a part to play in this whole dynamic, and I have to give you that moment to do your thing.
Your book is very much about your Mexican heritage, and you mentioned your parents there. Is there much of a comic book scene in Mexico?
That's a really good question. I was just there back in October, and I didn't get a chance to hit any of the shops. But from when I was a kid and I was there, and that kind of, there's a little bit about it in my book, that there are just reprints of, of the standard DC Marvel comics. But then there's also like and this is just going back to those days, but there's very specifically Mexican, there are these smaller comic books, smaller in size and stature, but they're very adult. There's a lot of witchcraft, and there's a lot of murder, and there's a lot of bodice ripping kind of scenarios that for a kid who likes superheroes, there was very little in there for me, and it was just more the titillation. Other than anything else, I would pick them up and I'd just be like, flip, 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 flip. Like, oh, I saw some stuff. Okay, put that down. Now back to Batman.
It'll be interesting to find out who the contemporary Mexican comics creators are and what they're doing. That'd be really interesting. If we move on to your book, which I've already said that I loved, partly because, I loved everything about it. I felt all the emotions whilst reading it. As a child, I watched a TV programme here called Blue Peter, which is for children, like a sort of magazine show. And they had a special, when I was, about 7 or 8, they had a special episode about Mexico. And from that moment, I had a childhood obsession with Mexico, and which is really a strange thing for somebody living in small town England. So I was very excited to see your book, and I found it really rich in so many ways.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say. Thank you.
But for people who maybe haven't read it yet, it's only just been released. Has it been released yet in England? It has just.
I think so.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of an introduction to the story of Mexikid and the story that's told within the book?
Sure. So when I was, I think when I was about 12, my parents crammed all 11 of us into this Winnebago motorhome and a pickup truck with ropes for seatbelts, and took us on this incredible 2,000-mile road trip down to Mexico to get my grandfather and bring him back to live with us in the United States. And I was not on board with this idea at all. This was not an idea. But, as a kid, you don't have the choice of, the idea your parents have. Yeah. So, and one of the reasons I was not on board with this idea is that, we were just living in a house that was built for 5, and there was already 11 of us in there. And then I knew for sure there was going to be a language barrier because my parents and my older siblings were all born in Mexico and grew up speaking Spanish. The younger 4 of us were born in the United States, and we learned a mix of Spanish and English. So I was just like, what am I going to talk to this guy about, and how? Can I, adequately explain the difference between Chewbacca and Bigfoot? I mean, there was just all the important things. Yes, all the important things would just get it. It's going to be a staring contest. So anyway, as the trip was goes along, I start hearing stories about my grandfather from older siblings and other people that start piquing my interest because they play him out to be kind of a hero type person. And it's like, oh, he might have been a hero of the Mexican Revolution. He might have been, a real proficient street fighter, and he could have been the very first Mexican Jedi. Like all these stories started flying around. And I'm like, okay, well, now I'm back on board. This is good. I want this guy on my team. And so when we finally get to my grandfather, he's not exactly what people have told me he is, or I don't see him that way. And also, he's not ready to come back to the United States to live with us. Mm-hmm. He still has something he's got to do, and unbeknownst to me in the story, I'm going to help him achieve his goals. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. At
what point did you realise that this... I think quite often we take for granted our experiences as children as normal, or that you sort of take them in your stride. At what point, and maybe think that might not be interesting to other people? Did you always know that this was a really fascinating and unusual story, or did that take you a little bit of a while to kind of come to that conclusion?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of times within my family, we'll just repeat the same stories over and over again. I'm sure this is true with every family. We'll get together at Christmas or on camping trips, and someone will start telling a story that we've already heard hundreds of times, right? Mm-hmm. But as they're going through the story, somebody in our family, it's the family motto. Somebody will interrupt and say, "Hey, that's not how that happened." And then they'll kick in with their version of the story, or their kind of Rashomon of the story. And as that was happening, I was kind of taking note, and I was one of the, the ones who'd like to tell the stories, but I was taking note that everybody had their own point of view on that story. And later I started thinking, well, that story must have meant a lot to everybody, because everybody had a, steel lock on that, mm-hmm. on their version of that story. And so those stuck with me, that these stories were important, not only to me, but they were important to them. And so I kind of hung on to them for a long time and thought oh, I would like to tell this story to a different audience someday. And, and so I kind of put that, especially this story, put this one in my back pocket for a long time.
So did you approach the story from that you were going to tell it from your version, from your own memories, or did you try and include other perspectives as well? Did you sort of refresh your own memory by doing a bit of research into that kind of family history?
Well, well, yeah, I did take some of the best bits that everybody I had taken note of that they had mentioned in their retellings of the story. And when I did tell the family I was going to do something like this, I actually sent out a text message to all my brothers and sisters and said, hey, I'm going to tell this story and I hope that's okay. And I think I have a book deal. And you guys, if you have any problems with it, tell me now and we can discuss offline or something. And to a person, they said the same thing. They said, that sounds great. Good luck with that. Which in my family means, I don't believe this is going to happen, you big liar.
Of course you're going to write a book.
Yeah, sure you are. So I took that as a seal of approval or disapproval, and I moved forward with it. But as I was writing the story, individually they would kind of come to me and they would throw me a memory and just say oh, do you remember that kid with the running nose and who wanted Pop Rocks from us? I'm like, oh, I totally forgot. And there's this perfect point that would happen, that would make sense. And I totally forgot that. And other details like that would always pop up where they would say so then after the fact, after I sold the story and I told my dad, I called him, I said, I sold the story. It's this story and I hope you're cool with it. And he got super excited about the whole idea. And then he started calling me almost every other day, at tequila o'clock. And he would be telling me more stories that he thought I could sell. He'd be like, oh, I got a good one for you. And then he would tell me this story. And sometimes, because of the tequila o'clock situation, sometimes he would tell me the same story multiple days in a row, but they would be sharper every time. He would have adjusted it for my laughter or my, shock or something.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
So they got better and better. And I'm like, oh, okay, I see what's happening. This is classic storytelling technique.
Yeah.
Where it's just I'm getting more vibe if I change the character to this, or I say the voice this way and stuff. So he was doing that the whole time I was working on the book. And, I told him, book's locked. I'm not adding new stuff to it. But he's just like, well, this was for your next one and you can use this and you can use that. So I got a lot of material out of him during that whole process, which is wonderful.
That's really great. And some of the elements of the story that made it into the book, I can imagine them being quite difficult experiences for you as a child. What was that experience like to go back and revisit those kind of trickier times?
That was really tough because I think I know what you're talking about. Two very darker incidences within the story. And when I wrote the first draft and I sent it into my editor, she had a lot to say about it because she was kind of like, you're playing some of this as comedy where it doesn't seem to be a comedic moment. It seems to be like you're looking back at it as an adult rather than experiencing it as a kid. And so she kind of challenged me to go back and rethink this story, but through young Pedro's eyes and kind of hear his thoughts and what he's thinking about at the moment. Because now when I tell some of those stories, or when I've even told the story about, towards the end of the book, it was always told as a comedy piece. It was always told about how flabbergasted I was and the stupid mistakes I made. But then when, I went to write it, the editor made a really good point. She was like, well, this is the first time these people are going to be hearing this story. Yeah. And they're going to be hearing it through the voice of a child. And the child is not going to be making fun of this. The child is going to be seriously traumatized by this incident. So it was a struggle for me to kind of drop the comedy and to be like, this is real, and treat it as such, as much as you can, and then you can use your comedy for deflating, any kind of issues afterwards.
Yeah, I think it really worked. You're able, as a reader, I felt able to feel those moments, and then also safe in your hands as a writer that we would come out of it and there would be some lighter moments as well afterwards. So yeah, I think it's definitely part of that kind of roller coaster journey through the book. As I said, I felt all the emotions. I wanted to talk a little bit about how the book started off. Am I right that it started as a webcomic, or that you started making comics online first before you got your book deal? How did you first get involved in creating comics?
Well, back when I used to work at Hallmark Cards, and when I first started, this was before they had computers and the internet and everything in your office. So we would have assigned work, and I would get like 3 cards a week to do, and I'd usually spit them out pretty quick. And then I would have 2 days at the end of the week with nothing to do. And so we had these little, they're called 3x5 cards, 3 inches by 5 inch cards that were in everybody's office, because at Hallmark, these were the currency of ideas. So if you had an idea, you'd write them on these cards and you'd put them in your boss's chair or an art director's chair or something. And then those would get elevated to somebody who would eventually make something of it or whatever. But anyway, we had these cards everywhere. And so when I got bored and I was done with my work, I would just start writing these little stories. Each card would be one panel. And these were just memories of my childhood. And so I would write little stories, and then I would put a rubber band around them. And then I had this Batman lunchbox, and I would just throw the piles into the lunchbox.
That's very cute.
And
imagine you having a little lunchbox.
I know it's still behind me. It's in my office. But so when I left Hallmark 27 years after, and I was unpacking stuff here at home, I found the lunchbox, and I popped it open, and I was like, oh my gosh, these are still here. And I went through them, and I was like, these are pretty funny. I kind of like these. And so I thought I would just put them out in the world as stories. What the heck? And so I just started doing this Instagram story thing using the rules of Instagram, which are like you can only have 10 pictures per story. And then I doubled it because I couldn't shut up. I'll make it 20. And so I just started doing a story every week, and I've done hundreds of these stories. And at some point I decided, well, I should get paid.
That's always nice.
I should try to make some money off of this. And so I packaged them up, and I packaged them up thematically, and then I wrote kind of a story in between the themes to tie them all together. And then I sent them out just blindly to just different publishers, and I got absolutely no response, nothing at all. And so then a friend of mine said, hey, you should probably get an agent, see if an agent can kind of crack the wall. And I'm like, okay. So I sent it to an agent, and this agent, Dan Lazar, really wonderful guy. I sent him this pitch, and he called me back, and he's just like, you know what? I don't like any of this.
Exactly the feedback you were looking for.
Yes, exactly. Well, he didn't say I don't like anything. He just says, I don't know what I could do with this. He says, but he said, in your final chapter story, he said there was one line that you wrote in there that says, we went down to Mexico to get my grandfather and bring him back to the United States. Things got dark, and I don't want to talk about it. And he's like, what is that about? And I'm like, oh, that. I'm like, well, I was frustrated there at the end. And and he's just like, well, tell me that story. I want that story.
Oh, so
he's like, put all this stuff away and just tell me that story. So I said, okay. So I outlined that story, and he's just like, yes, this is what we need. This is what we can sell. And so he kind of, which was the funniest part about this whole thing was that, I had grown up with comic books for years and years. So I understood comic books. And I don't think he thought I understood comic books because he'd only seen my Instagram stuff.
Yeah.
And so he was like, okay, tell me about the squares. Like, why squares? And I'm like, what do you mean, why squares? He's just like, everything's squares. What's that about? And I'm like, I don't know. That's how the universe sees Instagram, is squares. And he's like, have you ever considered the rectangle? I'm like, the rectangle. Yeah? He's like, yeah. He said, maybe rectangles. He said, rectangles mixed with squares. Have you ever thought of that? I'm like, I can see that. And he's just like, how about no rectangles and no squares? Have you ever thought of that? I'm like, that's a really good idea. I'll give that a shot. So I did. What the funniest part about that whole thing was that that we're on a Zoom call and there's a huge poster of Batman behind me the whole time. And I'm like, I know comic books. They're right behind me.
I love the way it moves in and out of different panel structures and at different points in the story. I love the colourways, and it feels the colours feel really nostalgic as well for like part of the story. I've just found it very engaging on lots of different levels.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, that whole thing was all done during the pandemic lockdown, and so I was down here, and I had this hard and fast rule, and my wife totally understands it. She's very, very understanding, and I told her I didn't want to show her anything until it was published, like no sketches, no nothing.
What?
Well, she could come down, because the walls were covered with sketches, but she wasn't allowed to like walk over to them and read them, because I love her so much that I only want her to see the purest version of it. And so there was so much I had to work out that I was just like, I don't want you to see the messy parts yet. I want you to see the finish. So she didn't see it until it was printed in the hardback that got delivered to the house. And I'm like, now you can read it.
That's crazy.
I know.
You blew my mind. It's on so many levels.
So the reason I told that story was because the only feedback I got was from my editor and my designer. So I didn't get really a lot of feedback. So I wasn't sure how people were going to read it and, absorb it. So I haven't been finding out about it until like this last month and a half or so.
And what's that been like?
It's been wonderful, and I'm humbled. Everybody's been just super, super sweet, and it has been very emotional to have people, read back to you or recite something you've written or talk about something you've drawn that you thought you had only done in your private, bat cave mind, kind of a thing, where they're just like, oh, this part meant a lot to me. And I'm like, how did you know about that? And you're like, well, it's in your book. I'm like, oh, that's right.
Yeah.
I forgot.
So my 9-year-old son has read it as well. I wasn't quite sure. He would normally read shorter stories, comics, more kind of comic strip style collections. I wasn't sure what he would make of it or what he'd take on board. And it was really, really interesting. He, first of all, he wants to go to Mexico to buy fireworks. That was his first takeout. Definitely. But at one point he referenced, I can't remember what happened, but it was like the right kind of circumstance. And is it grito, the noise that, I don't know how to
Oh, the grito, yeah.
He was like, I want to make that noise right now. And I was like, and it was the right context. I was like, oh, you've really absorbed it and taken it on. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
Awesome. I'm sure other cultures have their version of this. I don't know what it is. It's the combination of being sad and happy at the same time and not being able to express it other than this sound. And thank God we have it, because if I didn't have that sound to do, I'd be like, I don't know how to say what I need to say at this point. But when they were doing the audio version of the book, they wanted me to record myself doing it. And I was like, well, the person who's going to do it, my voice, is going to have to discover their own, because you can mimic somebody's, you can try. It's just, it'll be more authentic if he does it himself. Like if he goes off and figures his out, I won't be, mad that it doesn't sound like mine. I'm like, but it'll be authentic to him, kind of a thing. So he did, and it was wonderful.
I'm really fascinated that there's an audiobook. How does that work? Is it just of the words, or is there some kind of building in of the content of the images within that?
There's a lot of audio effects, a lot of background music, and descriptions, and it's really nice. It's like an audio play. It's really, really cool. They did a great job.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'll track that down. One of the things that I really loved as well was the depiction of siblings and that kind of family dynamic, which is a really big theme throughout. I just wondered, you're talking about the different kind of receptions that it has had, and have you had feedback from your family, from your siblings about it?
I was just going to check my email to see if there was any cease and desist. Nope, they're all good. I was just there and I saw a couple of them, and they had nothing to say. And I don't know. Well, I've gotten emails from some of the different brothers who have said, they really enjoyed it, but like there hasn't been like a deep discussion or questions about why am I wearing that shirt? Why did you do that haircut? Like none of that has been asked or addressed. So I think maybe around Christmas when we get together again, maybe that'll come up. So I'm still waiting to hear.
I need a bit more
I'm
time
still waiting
to
for the other
digest
shoe to
it.
drop. Yes, exactly. Well, even my brother Noe, who's kind of the antagonist in the book, I was kind of afraid that because he's still that guy. Yeah, he didn't change. The rest of us grew up, Noe. The rest of us grew up, and but he didn't say anything. I fully expected him to say something, and then I thought, well, maybe he didn't read it. So. But then he did let on that he had read it, and he was asking when the next one's coming out. And I was like, oh, okay, so then he approves, I guess. So, but I didn't want to go fishing for anything, because I didn't want to catch anything. So we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I really like to find out how people work. You've talked about having sketches on your wall. So are you very much a pencil and paper? If you come to a point where you had this book, what's your creative process?
As far as the drawing part of it, it started out with, this non-repo blue pencil that I've used for years on vellum. And the cool thing about that, and if anybody ever wants to kind of start this process, everything looks good in this blue pencil. You could draw anything, and it just looks like, oh, you're just getting started on a masterpiece. Everything looks like it's got potential, and then it goes to crap after that. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to say it. But so I started early on. I started that way, and then when the book got picked up, my wife bought me an iPad Pro with Procreate on it, which mimics the blue pencil and the vellum perfectly. Like I was able to adjust it so that it did the thing I liked when I was doing it with pencil and paper. So I was going through less vellum, but printing out everything and make it look like I had sketched all day. And I really liked it. It feels really good. And then I got it to mimic my pen work from my online drawings. So I was able to kind of ditch all the live pen stuff and just use all digital. So digital pencil, digital pen. And then the line work I would take and bring over to Photoshop, and then I would do all my color over in Photoshop. And then I had created a font when I started doing the online version. So I was able to use that font in the book. And so it all kind of came together pretty quickly once I figured out what all the tools did. And then I kind of, stuck to. I didn't want to explore new tools because I had the capacity for just these three things in my head, and I'm like, if I just stick to these and I do these as well as I can, then I don't need anything else, and it should be fine.
And how long did it take you from sort of start to finish? Because it's quite a substantial body of work. There's a lot of detail, and it's very thick. In terms of it's quite a long story, and there's a lot in it. So it feels like it would have been a lot of work.
Well, the funny thing is, so when I first got, I think it took me probably 6 months to get the pitch right before we got the book. So when the book sold, my first question which is my first question every time, is how long does this have to be? And my editor is just like, well, how long do you want it to be? And I'm like, I don't know, because it's my first book. I don't know, 250 pages. And she goes, oh, you sure? That sounds great. And then the next question is, when's it due? And she's like, well, when do you want it to be done?
How quickly can you do 250
pages? And I'm like, I don't know. And she's just like, well, let's pick a date. And so we picked a date. And I said, okay. I said, I'm going to give you all the finished roughs on that date. And she's like, okay, go. So this is after the manuscript was approved. And so I started working, and I worked just nonstop. Towards the end there, I was getting up at 5:30 in the morning and working till 5:30, 12 hours straight, just cranking. And so on the day it was due, I was putting together my PDFs to send, and I was looking at the PDF count, and the PDF count was like 320. And I was just like, oh, that's reasonable. Like, I've seen books that are a little bit like in that range, 320. So I'm like, cool. And then I looked again. I'm like, well, no, that's 320 spreads. That's 640 pages. So then I just hit send.
Oh, well.
I'm like, oops. I overshot. So the first pencil draft was 640 pages. And it took like, I think a week before she got back to me. And she goes, Pedro, she goes, did you realize that this is 640 pages? And I'm like, yeah. She goes, we don't do books that long, right? And I'm like, uh-huh. And she's like, because that would be fiscally responsible. And I'm like, I get you. Because it needs to come down by half. I'm like, okay. So I gave them a pass at it. I said, why don't you guys take a stab, and then I'll take a stab. And so they took a stab at it, and then the following week I took a stab at it, and I was able to tear away about 300 pages, in a weekend. I think I just literally tore pages apart and slapped panels into places and kind of re-put it together and send it back. So this is what I need to save to tell the story. And she was just like, that's great, that's perfect, let's just clean up the edges and make the transitions work, and then that's better. So yeah, I learned a lot. Maybe it doesn't feel like there's parts missing or things that have, like, it doesn't feel like it's been halved when you're reading it. So yeah, definitely. Oh, good. So definitely was a good process, I think. But yeah, it must be difficult to leave all of that work to one side. No. No. You know what is interesting? I had mentioned this story to somebody else, and I said, the cool part about it is that you do get to like lay it all out and just kind of see what makes the story and what doesn't make the story, which when in your head you think it all makes the story, and then when you see it kind of spread out in front of you, you're just like, well, this is just, this doesn't help at all.
This podcast is listened to by a lot of teachers and librarians, people working in education, as well as comics creators. I just wondered, I think it's really interesting to dig into a little bit of the idea of how your experiences in education have helped you, do you think, on your journey? Although it was quite an extended journey, or something that you came to sort of later in life, do you think there are any things that you learnt or experiences that you had in your education that have helped you on that journey?
I think a lot of it, and I've talked to some people in the library world just recently who've reminded me of the kindness and the patience that teachers and librarians specifically take with kids who are trying to find where they belong in the world, or even the importance of whatever story they're trying to tell, or whatever story they're trying to find. And I think, in the U.S. right now, we're having this terrible discussions of banning books, which is horrifying, and they're banning them for no reason other than it's politics. But when you go into a library, you're going in to find yourself, and if you can't find yourself in a library, you have to go someplace else to find yourself, and sometimes those places are sketchy. And so I've always found that teachers and librarians have always been able to like kind of give me a real safe space to discover things and gently push me towards things that they think, this kid might react well to this. And, I remember a teacher saying, oh, you might like this book of Norse legends. This kind of seems your way because it has these really wonderful drawings that I know you like to draw, and that it has these crazy stories of gods and serpents and whatever. And I'm like, yeah, 100% load me up. And I remember walking away from those stories, those books, not so much about the stories, but about those drawings. And I'm like, I've never known a Clydesdale before. And like, now all I want to do is draw Clydesdales, it's just, which I still can't do, but it's just, that the inspiration.
Yeah.
So it's the tiniest thing you could do, the tiniest moment to give a kid is the best thing in the world. And you'll think you didn't do enough that day, but if you did it once, you've done plenty, So that's kind of my message to teachers is like, it's appreciated and you probably don't hear it often enough, but those little niceties and those little moments are really, really, they're the seeds that grow years from now. People will remember that you did that.
Hear, hear. Well done. That was amazing. Thank you. Completely agree. You've mentioned you had lots of other stories from your dad, but what have you got planned next? Is it more in the kind of memoir space? Are you thinking about doing something different? What do you think's next for you? Or what do you know is next for you?
Well, I don't know what's next. I'm working on a sequel to Mexikid. Our family, I know I shouldn't even be talking about this.
Top secret.
My agent's going to get mad. My agent, he doesn't listen to this stuff. Put it at the very end. He won't get to it. So my family, we grew up as a family of sharecroppers. So we picked strawberries all summer long and on the weekends. So that was our whole family was out in the fields. And so this all takes place in that world of immigrant labor and work and kids, underage kids being out in the fields, the little kids. My little brother Alex was probably I think I started when I was probably 7 or 8, so he was probably 5 or something when he started picking strawberries. So we were little kids.
I can't get my children to do anything.
Although we got paid, we got
there we go.
So there was that. So it's this whole adventure of the last year of that time when my father gave us the option of continue working with him or leave and go learn to do something completely new. So he gave us this amazing decision to make, and so that's kind of where the story starts. Is where he says, okay, you don't have to come back, but you have to do something else. And so everybody has to figure out what they're going to do.
That's really cool. That sounds very, very interesting. I love it.
So hopefully we'll get that one out. And then I also kind of in the back of my head have been wanting to do this. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to figure out the term I want to use about it, but it's kind of like Latino retrofuturistic sci-fi serial comic book.
Cool.
Yeah, I had kind of been playing with some ray gun stuff when I was a few years ago, where I was just like, you never see Mexicans in the Flash Gordon world. What if the world of Flash Gordon was started in Mexico, and what would that world look like? What would the 1930s cool retro sci-fi look like if it was Mexico? And so it's that's kind of what I'm playing around on the back burner myself.
That sounds amazing. So to end the podcast, I ask guests if we were to add one comic or book to our to be read piles tomorrow, what would you recommend we read? I just
started rereading, talking about sci-fi. I just started rereading Tom Strong. It's a comic book series from Alan Moore and Chris Sprouse, and it's this very super optimistic story about this superhero that was created by his parents. He's kind of a science experiment where they're trying to make the ultimate man. But it's set in this not too distant future, and it's every trope that every comic book has already done, but in this just really lively and fun and unheavy kind of storytelling. But it's just really fun, and I keep a stack of them in the the side table next to the bed, and I pull one out every once in a while just to kind of oh, that's right, comic books are fun, and they're not it's not all zombies and not all
I'm just looking at pictures of him now. There he is. He's very muscly. Why is the ideal man's always very muscly? That's a very fixed notion.
Good point. Good point. These stupid comic books. But it's just really what I don't know. For some reason, it just spoke to me, and I was wanting to kind of refresh my brain during these dark times. And I pulled out a stack and I said,
I think it's important. We have to have like moments of lightness, don't we? And reading is a great place to retreat to in those challenging times. And and that's exactly what you want, is something that's fun.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pedro. I've absolutely loved talking to you. I definitely recommend everyone go out and buy Mexikid right now if they haven't yet. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. And, I hope everybody enjoys, a little bit or all of it. And then if you don't, pass it on to somebody else. I appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
There you have it. Thanks so much, Pedro, for coming on this episode. It was great to talk to you. It's brilliant to be so inspired and enthusiastic about a book and then be able to talk to its creator so soon after it's come out. That was a brilliant experience for me. So thank you for coming onto the show. My mind is blown mostly by the fact that you did not show your wife the book at all until it was already printed. That is crazy. Really enjoyed that little nugget. I thought just to end this episode, I would put together, because I do love memoirs and graphic memoirs so much, so I thought I'd just pull together a very short and top line, just a few things, a few titles that I have enjoyed that would be for younger readers. There's a vast, vast amount for older readers out there. I do get referenced quite a lot, can't help myself, in the podcast. But there's also a few titles that I think would be great to have in libraries. Obviously, it goes without saying, Raina Telgemeier is the OG when it comes to graphic memoirs for younger readers for 9+. If you aren't familiar with her titles, check out Smile as a starting point. There's so many great titles that she's written, and they're very much the foundation of what I see to be the thriving graphic memoir genre for children out there today. Also, of course, Where Stars Are Scattered by Victoria Jameson and Omar Mohammed, and another great, very well-known graphic memoir for children aged 9+. Victoria's been on the show as well, so if you have not listened to Victoria's episode of Comic Boom, go back into the archive, episode 10 of season 2, and you will find Victoria's episode there. I actually thought that was a great one for younger listeners as well, to be shared with the class if you happen to be looking at Where Stars Are Scattered in your classwork. So I did actually, on the website, Comic Boom website, I put chapters in there to help you find the right sections that might be suitable to having a little listen with your class or comics group as well. So that's available. Something I was sent, sometimes people send me things through, keep me up to date with what's out there. And I was sent by Jim Bolton, a digital archaeologist, that's his Instagram title anyway, I believe it, some information about a comic series that he's working on. And I'm going to put some links to the Padlet. But I thought it was a really interesting concept, this idea of the people that have been sort of absolutely core to creating the online digital world that we now all take for granted, and what their roles have been in the creating and the architecture of that digital world. And this is what Jim sent me. He said that he's currently working on a series of comics that tell the stories of engineers who laid the foundations of our digital world. Much more eloquent than my ramblings previously. It says, we're all familiar with the tales of plucky startups launching their businesses from humble garages, but what about the unsung heroes who laid the foundation without any expectation of personal gain? Okay, so these are the people that aren't getting rich. Unsung Heroes of the Information Age pays tribute to these selfless trailblazers and celebrates the original spirit of the internet, a spirit categorized by openness, generosity, and collaboration. So I thought they sounded really interesting. The first comic's available, Soul Searching, telling the story of the Barbados-born inventor of the search engine, Alan Emtage. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the second, Line in the Sand, tells the story of Lynn Conway, who's had a groundbreaking role in the invention of the methodology that enables today's billion transistor microchips. That sort of thing blows my mind. It's not a world that I know a lot about, especially not the kind of technological terms, but there just definitely seems like there is, yet again, we think of maybe hidden stories being something of the past, but it seems no, very much it's still happening today. The history that we find out about is not all that there is. I thought that was a really interesting sounding project and it really piqued my interest. I wanted to share with you. Another title that someone sent me a little link about, tagged me in a post on Instagram about, was from a regular listener from Library Mice who listens to the show. Hi, Library Mice. And she sent me details of a book that's just come out called Layers by Penelope Bagot. It's out in hardback, came out at the end of October. The blurb on that is, Penelope Bagot pens her first autobiographical work in a hilarious and bittersweet young adult graphic memoir. Penelope never thought she'd create a graphic memoir, but when she dusted off her old diaries, no, really, this book is based on her actual diaries, she found cringeworthy, hilarious, and heartbreaking stories begging to be drawn. In Layers, Bagot reflects on her childhood and teen years with characteristic wit and unflinching honesty. The result is 15 short stories about friendship, love, grief, and those awkward first steps towards adulthood. That sounds really good. I have ordered it. It hasn't come yet, but I am looking forward to reading that. As a teenage diarist myself, I don't know if I'm looking forward to reading it actually now. I've just considered that. But I am looking forward to reading it. It should be really good. So yeah, another one to check out for older readers, 14 plus, that one. That's not my personal opinion. That is from the internet. And one further recommendation, of course, from the beginning of this season, Emma Reynolds' Drawn to Change the World, another brilliant collection of graphic memoirs tracking the lives and the early experiences of young environmental campaigners from across the world and how their campaigns grew and linked in with each other to form a global movement that we now know today. If you want to hear more about that, tune into episode 1 of season 3 with Emma Reynolds. I'm a massive fan of that book as well. Thank you so much for listening. This was the penultimate episode of Comic Boom. Next week's going to be our last one for this season. There is a number of things happening in next week that might mean that episode comes out a little bit late, just prior warning, but it will be there within the week. So just keep your eyes peeled on your Apple Podcast, on your Spotify, in case I get it out a day late or something like that. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can support and follow the podcast on Instagram at comic_boom_podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Lucy_Braidley. And you can also support the podcast on kofi.com/LucySB. That's ko-fi.com/LucySB. And on there, you can have a look at some of my comics. You can buy comics that I have made, and you can contribute to the podcast. If you would like to support the podcast in a non-monetary way, which probably is what most people would like to do, then that is also very, very welcome. You can do that by tweeting, by sharing episodes, by telling your colleagues, and also by leaving reviews on platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify, wherever you're accessing this content, and that just really helps people to be able to access it and know that it's quality, hopefully you think it's quality, and share the love of the podcast. So thank you so much for listening today. You've been listening to Comic Boom, which is produced and hosted by me, Lucy Starbuck Braidley. Thanks for listening.